I would like to introduce Sarah. She, in addition to having her private practice, she's also a program leader for Decker Communications. That is a leading communications training company. She is also a program manager for Women Unlimited, and that is a national company that develops high-potential women leaders at major corporations. Sarah is a Brown grad. I believe she graduated with a BA in Semiotics and Communications. And in addition, she also serves as one of our Brown Executive Coaches, and she is certified by the Coaches Training Institute. Now, before Sarah got into this world of coaching, she was the director at the Walt Disney Company. She founded a company called West Coast Advantage, which was an advertising sales firm where she had a variety of clients like Apple, Gap, Microsoft, the Hearst Corporation. So Sarah did a great job of combining this background, getting some training, using her wonderful skills that she gained in leadership and sales, and to really make a unique blend of coaching, training, and developing leaders and managers. And we feel lucky to have Sarah back with us today. And Sarah, welcome. Let's talk about negotiating.
Thank you. Good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast. It's only 9 here in San Francisco. I'm excited to be here today to talk about what I call the art of negotiating. We are negotiating every day, even though we don't realize it. So you are probably most comfortable thinking about negotiation, about salaries or promotions, and of course we negotiate for houses and cars. But the truth is, every day you're facing negotiations, and it might be just negotiating to push through a new idea at your company. It might be negotiating with your kids, or even negotiating with your spouse on where to go on vacation. There isn't really an exact recipe for negotiating, but there is a methodology, and that's what I want to talk about today. It's a methodology that will give you a foundation, something solid to use as a process when you know you're entering into a negotiation. And most people have a preconceived notion of negotiation. And in fact, Heather's going to send out a chat right now and ask you just for some of the words that come to mind when you think of negotiation. Negotiations are very different for most people. Some people really embrace them. They see it as a challenge. Some people avoid them like the plague because they think they're entering into a conflict. And the key is that as you come to a negotiation, you are most likely having a different perception and mindset than the person with whom you're negotiating. So you're starting already at two different places. Heather, can you read some of the words that maybe came through that people are thinking about when they think of the word negotiation?
People are saying that they have to compromise. They are seeing it as a give and take. They someone says a convergence of interests. Let's see, lots coming in. Seeing it as a trying to get to somewhere positive. Fighting an uphill battle, that's a good one. Mediation, a whole variety of things coming in here.
Yeah. So again, the key is you've got a preconceived notion, and your mindset is going to drive your behavior and the outcome of your negotiation. So we are going to talk about mindset because this is something where you actually have control and you have a chance to set yourself up for success with the right mindset. We will also talk about what I call the prep process. What do you actually have to do to prepare to get yourself into a position where you can create a win-win? And we'll talk about some nonverbal communication and then some gender differences towards the end. Negotiation, for many people, is viewed as a conflict. And the truth is, when you come to a negotiation and you've got a different need or want than somebody else, it technically is a conflict, but it doesn't have to be a negative conflict. So if you actually looked up negotiation in the dictionary, it's a discussion. It's aimed at just reaching an agreement between two or more persons or parties. A discussion, that's a very different approach than most people have. So when you're entering into a mindset for a negotiation, remember, this is something that you have control over. You can prep yourself. And while it seems fundamentally natural that we would prep ourselves, the truth is most people don't actually take the time to set a mindset. Oops. Uh-oh. Sorry, clicked the wrong button. When you're setting up your mindset, you want to reframe it as a problem-solving opportunity. It is a mental process that involves discovering, analyzing, and overcoming obstacles. So if you walk into it thinking about problem solving, you are going to have a different tone and different behavior that will lead you really to a place of solution. To be solution-minded, you've got to think about what's possible. What we tend to do is we focus on what's not possible, and we tend to focus more on what's in it for us versus mutual benefits, which we'll talk about later. But just to give you an example, I have a client who is a very senior partner at an accounting firm, and he wanted to take a sabbatical, really a summer off to be with his family to do some neat sailing trip. And their fiscal at this firm is a September 1 fiscal, and nobody leaves before September 1 because they want to be paid for the full year. And he was so focused on what has been done at the firm, which is that you stay until September 1, that he was willing to walk from some of his annual pay. I said, how come you don't ask? Has anybody ever taken a sabbatical? And a sabbatical is not a normal thing at this firm. What happens is people leave and they go for good. And so he didn't even think to ask for his full pay, even though he was leaving before September 1. And focusing on what had been was keeping him pretty stuck. Long of the short of it is, he did ask for his full pay. He made an agreement to check in once a week when he hit land because he was going on a sailing trip. And it worked out for everyone. But again, it was that mindset where he was stuck in that place of what had been. You want to make sure that you really consciously enter into a collaborative mindset. We tend to see it as a bit adversarial by the nature of often wanting something different than what the other person has offered. And taking the time to envision an agreement, to believe that something can happen, is really where you're going to get the mindset that affects your behavior and the outcome. So as we move away from mindset, and again, it's the level of being conscious when you're setting up your mindset and just taking the time beforehand to consciously prepare yourself. But then there's an actual prep process that you want to follow to get yourself in the best position to actually move through the negotiation. And we're going to talk about each of these steps, but it's a process of getting clear, analyzing your listener, really assessing the situation, and then knowing how to position your request. I call this the CLAP process, just so you can remember it. C for clarity, gaining clarity, knowing your listener, L, making an assessment, and wisely positioning. And we're going to go through each one of these. So clarity is really for you. It is meant to empower you. It is so interesting to recognize that when you're not clear on your goals, it is amazing how the conversation turns more emotional. You want to know what your ideal situation is. This is a place where people often get stuck because they don't believe that they should think so big, think so perfectly. But truly imagine your ideal situation so that you are clear on what you're working towards, what you're hoping for. And know your alternatives and options. Clearly, people who have alternatives and options tend to be in a better position to negotiate. But recognize really, truly what are your options. We often think that we don't have options. And we always have an option. It may not be a good option, but we always have options and choices. Know very clearly what you're willing or not willing to give up. Again, this empowers you to create boundaries. And know your high, medium, and low price. And I put quotations around price because it isn't always an actual number that you're negotiating for. But know what is the highest thing you really want to go for? What's the lowest where you're going to walk if it's any lower than that? So I'm curious for all of you, which one of these questions feels the hardest for you? Heather, are you going to send out a chat on that?
Yeah, so I've sending this out. Would love to get people's ideas of what causes a conflict. I also wanted to throw out to send in some questions because I was happy to see that a lot of the response to the first question weren't so negative, they sort of saw the positives of negotiations as getting to win-win. So that I'm wondering if you can say, but yes, what is it then that makes it hard that you're here with us today? And I think this question will get at it, but if it's not, also send us that too.
Yeah, so what feels hardest for you in a negotiation?
So we're getting a lot of 4s, a lot of 5s, a lot of 3s.
Okay. So again, what's tough here is knowing your boundaries. What happens when you don't know your boundaries, what I'm willing to give up and what I'm willing to take? When you don't know your boundaries, emotions start to take over, and the other person starts to steer the conversation. So the reason why clarity is so critical for you is you empower yourself and you know your boundaries. That's really what you're creating with clarity. Any questions that came along with that, Heather?
There was a lot of people saying, you know, I tend to self-edit, and so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about maybe what are some of the signs, like the guy with the sailboat, that you're cutting off your options.
The signs are when you don't go through these questions, because it just means you're not connecting with what you really want. And the truth is people tend to block themselves before they've even really allowed themselves to know that something is a possibility. It's just human nature to assume that things won't be based on a precedent. Your ideal situation is often something that you'll say, that'll never happen. But it is absolutely amazing to me when people are able to articulate their ideal situation, how much further they can go in a negotiation, because they're striving for something bigger than they would have asked for in the first place.
So do not forget that question too. Keep it on the prominent.
It is critical to know who your listener is. And again, these are fairly fundamental things, but the truth is they are rarely top of mind. Know who your listener is. What do they care about? All of these questions that we're going to go through right now are critical in helping you position your request. What do they care about? What are the benefits to them? And we forget that the person with whom we're speaking is potentially your greatest source of information. You can ask that person what matters to them. You can ask that person all kinds of questions that give you insight into what matters to that person. Now, I have an example of an individual who works for a design firm. And it's about a 30-person firm, and the individual's COO. And this individual wanted to hire an internal person to take a lot of the management responsibilities off his plate. He had to get approval from the head of the firm, who's a very creative individual, and the CFO, a numbers-driven individual. And this person went to the head of the firm and talked about how in Asia they are very excited to hire American firms to do architecture and design, and talked all about the creative nature and the potential growth of the company. He then went to the CFO and had the exact same conversation about how creative they could be and how this is going to grow and how exciting it is. The head of the firm said, yes, great idea. The CFO said, no, we can't handle the headcount. About a week later, my client recognized that he was not speaking the right language to the CFO, that all the CFO focuses on is the numbers. And it was so amazing. He went back to the CFO with a numbers conversation about how much it would cost in the first 6 months to have this individual, what the rate of return would be, how much more my client would be able to get out of the office in order to generate new business, and made it a very numbers-oriented conversation. And guess what? They got the approval for the additional person. So it's so critical to know what matters to your listener and to get as much information as you can about that person so that you can position your request using their language. And don't make assumptions that you know this person. Really seek out information and find people who might know this individual. People are motivated by completely different things, and we're all familiar with some of these individuals from the office. All he wanted to do was be liked. all this guy, what's his name again? Gandolfino. I forget his name. I'm blanking. He was motivated by power. And if any of you remember, she was motivated 100% by what worked for her. You need to know what motivates your listener. And the other piece of the listener is you need to know who's the decision maker. So often we're speaking with somebody who then has to get approval from somebody else. Now, how do you figure out who the decision maker is? Again, the person with whom you're speaking, with whom you might be negotiating, is often your greatest source of information. Ask that person questions such as, is there anybody else who's involved in this decision? Is there anybody else who's going to care? Should I speak with anybody else? And again, these are so basic, but most of us don't think about it. We don't think about asking these basic questions. But it's critical to figure out whether the person with whom you're speaking is influential, can help you get what you want. In terms of assessing the situation, you want to weigh the benefits and the costs of negotiating. And usually we focus on the costs. And the costs are often emotional. So for example, you're going to look greedy, or somebody's not going to like you. And those are the things that often stop us from even entering into a negotiation. But if you weigh the benefits, focusing more on benefits than costs, you will actually step into this place of believing that things are possible. You want to know your competition. And often when we enter into, say, a salary negotiation, we don't even know where to start. So obviously you're going to, try to get information on your competition, and Heather has some links and some places where you can gather that information. But think about your competition and think about the company perhaps where you're working to get a promotion or where you're trying to negotiate a job. Think about getting information in different ways. So a couple of really good ways to understand where the competition is in the market, where your firm might be in the market, is to actually listen to some quarterly calls, to get an annual report. The website is the stuff that they want the public to know. But these other means are places where you can understand the company from a different perspective. It makes you look really savvy, and it helps give context to whatever you're asking for. And don't forget to ask those questions. Those questions can be asked of former employees, current employees. If you're working on a new job, talk to the recruiter. Get as much information as you can about the competition, and don't make it just about salary. When you're positioning your request, you want to frame it around benefits. So this really goes back to the whole point about the listener. If you don't understand your listener, then you are not positioning the request in language that they care about. Try to find ways that you can talk through a situation that resonates with your listener. So a couple of things. If you know your listener likes sports, perhaps use a sports analogy. But figure out what resonates with them. Use if I, then you language. And use that kind of language because what it shows is I'm willing to do this and I'm hoping you're going to do this. And it feels very mutual that you're moving into a place of we're both going to work together. Really the bottom line when you're positioning is to recognize that every individual is thinking about what's in it for them. And I don't mean that selfishly. But people are worried about their own jobs. They're worried about their own bottom line. They're worried about how their bosses are going to view them. So if you can take time to step into a situation where all you're focusing on is what's in it for them. What's in it for them is positioning it in a way that they connect to what you're saying. Any questions here?
Yes, Sarah, there's been a lot of comments coming in, and a lot of it is around, especially that came in from the question before with the, which of these five is the hardest. And as I see you moving through these other slides, it seems that part of it really gets caught up in, the cost. What does it cost for me? What am I worth? That value, and it's putting it all together. So can you just talk a little bit about what are you willing to give up and how that relates to really valuing your worth?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Well, there's a lot of people saying, it's really hard to know what I'm willing to give up. It's really hard to know what I'm valued at. How do I know what is my price without seeming greedy? And as you were just talking about costs, I thought that all seems to relate.
Well, the thing is you have to actually spend the time talking to yourself about what your boundaries are. And it's amazing how people really don't do that. But in terms of knowing the competition, Heather, as I said, has some resources. It really helps to ask, even if the person with whom you're interviewing, for example, because I gather this is around salary, ask them what their range is. Ask them, where they stand in terms of the competition. They are an incredible source of information, and we generally forget to ask them. I don't know if I'm answering that question or not, Heather.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good part of it.
And in terms of your value, in terms of an individual's value, it's got to start with you. If you don't believe in your own value, you're not going to be able to communicate that.
Yes, and I think that it is part of what affects that. That whole mindset really was a nice place to start with this whole process. There was two other questions that I thought this might be a good time one to discuss, and one is, what if the difficulty of understanding how to negotiate with either a really small startup business or a family-run business. Have you encountered any of that?
Oh, well, it's so interesting. I just had a client who's going through that right now. So a startup business often doesn't have a lot of money, and they often talk about equity. A great way to potentially do it, if you're in a position to do this, is to ask for a consulting fee for 3 or so months and gauge where the business is. And often they have, small budgets for consulting. It may not be quite as much as you would want. But see if you can talk to any other consultants in your area of expertise. But that is a great way to make sure you get a little money in your pocket and then see how well the company's doing, because equity is a big part of startups. And family-run businesses, I'm not sure I have anything specific to say about that. Usually equity is not available.
And every business does run a little different in terms of a family-run business.
But again, I would encourage everyone to go to the source of the person with whom you're negotiating. We really, truly forget to ask that individual for information. And often they can give you information. So, for example, with a startup, as my recent client is doing, she forgot to even ask them, what have you spent on marketing? Even a question like that gives you an idea of how much money they have. Are they spending tons of money on marketing? Are they not spending a lot of money on marketing? But even that gives you some insight into the company.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, let's continue, and then I think some of the questions will be answered as you keep talking, too.
Okay. So again, I do want to stress that these are things you just want to put in your level of consciousness. We know it. All of us know these things to do, but we don't usually consciously move through these steps of setting a mindset that's effective and really moving through that prep process, which is fairly basic, but again, not usually top of mind. Nonverbal communication is critical in any business setting, but particularly when you're negotiating. You want to exude confidence, likability, and credibility. If you are feeling confident, what is happening is that you have a clear, focused message. When you are unclear, and that's why that piece of clarity is so important, when you are unclear, you exude a lack of confidence. So having that clarity gives you that sense of confidence and empowerment. I probably don't have to tell most of you firm handshakes, sitting up straight and leaning in, but focus on the I, because when you're with somebody and you might feel uncomfortable or it might just be a small group or one person, we tend not to look directly at our listener. We tend to look up, down, and away. And if you can take 3 to 5 seconds and actually look at your listener, you have made a connection and you have told them, I'm not afraid of this. Likability. I'm sure most of you are very likable. But believe it or not, we forget to smile. Smiling puts people at ease. Smiling exudes warmth. Another thing you want to think about is matching your listener's energy level. Rarely do we put much thought into this. So if you have somebody, say you're high energy, I'm fairly high energy, and you're speaking with somebody who is fairly low energy, people with high energy tend to be uncomfortable with silence. So if you're with somebody who has less energy than you do, slow down and leave moments of pause. That person needs time to process that perhaps you don't need. Be okay with silence. And the same thing the other way around. If you're lower energy and you're communicating with somebody of higher energy, push yourself a little bit. That person is talking faster. That person is talking more. So you're going to have to meet that person closer to their energy level. And always try to find a way to connect with something personal. If you're in their office, find something on their wall and just make a connection. If you've read something about them, if you've seen them on the sidelines of soccer, make a connection at the beginning with something personal. And acknowledge what you're hearing. People like to be acknowledged. And you can just use phrases like, so what I hear you saying is, and I recognize that piece of acknowledgement makes you likable, makes that person connect with you. And the other piece is credibility. One of the reasons, again, you want to be really clear and focused on your message and have done your prep work is because the more you focus on the facts and the clarity, the less emotional you are. If emotion comes into play, you lose credibility. When I say dress smart, I know all of you dress smart. You all dress lovely, I'm sure. But I'm saying dress according to where you are. I went up to Seattle last week on business, and the dress there is so distinctly different than Baltimore, where I was 2 weeks before. And I worked for an individual a while back who came from New York, high-level executive, would come to San Francisco, meet with another high-level executive, and the New Yorker was in a fancy, blue suit with tie, and we were calling on the Gap, and the Gap people would be sitting there in their casual wear. And really he looked like an idiot because he didn't understand his audience. And he lost some credibility. In fact, I asked him not to come back to the market anymore in a very nice way. Reference credible sources. Anytime you can take I out of a conversation and make a reference, as I read in the Wall Street Journal, as your former colleague said, you are gaining credibility. And use facts. And again, focus on holding that eye contact 3 to 5 seconds. That may seem very awkward for people, but that is how you make that connection. It's not a 1-second look or a 2-second look. It's actually 3 to 5 seconds. Heather, can you see if anyone has questions here that might need to be addressed?
I'm not getting any specifically about this area. There's a couple about the end, but I think once we move forward, we might get it. I was laughing. We just had, we're so lucky to get Barbara Tannenbaum to do an yes, she did an introductory video for our new interviewing tool, and she also was the keynote speaker at an event we just had, and all she talked about was your body language, your nonverbal communication, and those messages. So it's so important to keep honing in on that.
Right. And before we get into touching on the gender and salary negotiations, I want to go back to the significance of your mindset, because the clearer you are, the more information you have at your fingertips, the more empowered you are. And emphasizing again that this seems basic, but the truth is we don't have that level of consciousness in preparing ourselves. Gender and salary negotiations. There has been a lot in the news in the last year about gender and salary negotiations. And the truth is that there was CNN Money last year did a study And women, after graduating from college, women are earning $8,000 less than men. I've seen the range from $7,700 to $8,000. And part of the issue is they're starting at a lower pace. So 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road, that $800,000 is over $100,000 difference. So why is this happening? And what I'm going to talk about are general understandings of what's going on. I recognize that some people will not follow this trend, but the truth is generalizations happen because of a reason, which is that there's a larger percentage of people falling into a category where they don't actually tend to negotiate. Women negotiate 30% less than men. Women tend to view negotiations as a conflict. Men tend to see negotiations as a competition. So they get revved up and they expect to negotiate. Women rarely expect to negotiate. And the expectation, that almost it goes back to setting your ideal scenario, is women's expectations tend to be lower. They don't even allow themselves to think about that ideal scenario. And again, if you can't think of that ideal scenario, you're definitely not going to be able to create it. Women are almost pre-programmed not to ask. 20% of adult women never even negotiate. And I remember when my younger daughter was selling Girl Scout cookies, and this is how young it begins. And she would go up to the doors of our neighbors and not even ask. And I took her, after the second year, I said to her, her name's Paige, I said, Paige, why is it you're not even asking? What are you afraid of? And her response was, I'm afraid they'll say no. And I said, but if you don't ask them, you don't even have a shot at yes. Now, I have a recent client who is highly skilled and trained in a very specific area of engineering. And she took a month off in between jobs, and she knew she'd get another job fairly quickly because she's so highly specialized. And she sat down in my office so excited. She'd gotten a job offer. It was great. And I asked her if she negotiated. And she said, I didn't negotiate because it was more than I thought she would get based on her last job. She didn't even negotiate. It didn't occur to her because they offered her more than she was getting at her last job. I, of course, gave her a piece of my mind, but anyway. So part of the key is that women need to shift their expectation. Women need to step into the asking process. You need to ask for what you want. You need to expect more. You need to initiate the conversation. And you need to believe in your value. A recent situation came up where an individual was asking for more money. And she had a counterpart who was a male. And she was given the explanation that she made less money because she hadn't been there as long. Now, she did not make this into a male-female discussion. She made it into a discussion about the work she was delivering and the work he was delivering. And what she did is she went through all of the things that she has achieved that meet the expectations of her boss. And she compared it to her counterpart, who's doing the same thing. They've got the same job. And she said, it doesn't matter how long I've been here. I'm meeting the same expectations he's meeting. I'm doing the same thing he's doing. And guess what? She got the raise because it was about the work and the expectations and the quality, and it wasn't about male versus female, and it wasn't about how long you've been here. She made it into a significant discussion about what really mattered to her boss, which was the quality of the work and meeting the expectations. I'm assuming people have some questions around salary negotiation for maybe women in particular, but this information will help men too. Make sure you ask for what you want and expect. This isn't just for women. We all have to negotiate salaries at some point in our life. And being courageous enough to even ask, being courageous enough to believe in your value really runs across both sexes. I think that often comes up for people is, when do I negotiate? When you're within a company Obviously, a clear time to negotiate is following the wake of some success, some achievement. When you are negotiating for a salary and you have not yet gotten the job, at all costs avoid giving a number in the first conversation. And when you're pressed, when somebody asks you what you're making, a great answer is, in my career, I have made from X to X. And you can give them a range. Rarely does somebody jump over that sort of boundary that you've just set and push you to say, no, what are you making now? But giving them a range leaves you pretty wide open.
Mm-hmm. Is there a difference, Sarah, in discussing salary if you're still early in your career as opposed to a little later? How much sort of power do you have if you're in your first couple of years of a job?
You know, part of it comes down to what are your other options, how do you compare in the marketplace, and how much you believe in yourself. I wouldn't say that there's it's so different where you are in your career, what industry you're in. There isn't any one magic answer really to any of these scenarios. Mm-hmm. The key is to recognize your value always, not only within the company, but outside the company. And I'm not talking just about salary when I say value. You want to always be that savvy business person where somebody recognizes that you're thinking beyond your individual contribution, that you're thinking broader and about the business as a whole. And think about whatever department you're in, whoever you're speaking to, they may be in a different department. So what matters to them and their bottom line may be driven by very different things than your bottom line. And always be aware that the more you can come across as a savvy business person, knowing the industry, knowing the trends. I mean, I wonder how many people actually look at the stock price of a company where you're negotiating and you look at the competition. Little things like that, when you can talk about trends, you create more value for yourself. And really what it is, and I talk to executives about this, it's moving beyond that individual contributor mindset and thinking more like a broader leader. So you want to create that perception as early on in your career as you can, and you increase your value.
That's a good point, because a couple of people have said, well, what if you didn't really have a previous salary, or what if it's in a different field? And so that's where, so how does giving the range help? And it's knowledge. It's saying, I've done my homework, I've done my research. I know what to expect. I'm valuable
right.
to you, exactly. There's a lot of questions about what if you have a difficult boss, what if the person's trying to get you to say something negative, and those are all personal, difficult questions that there's not going to be. I'm hesitating to the audience to say that's hard to bring those up. It's hard for Sarah to answer those because those are very specific situations. Do you have some just basic tips?
The one thing I would say is if you have a difficult boss, do everything you can to build relationships and network outside of your boss. If you can gain support, if you can gain visibility outside of this one relationship, you have a much better shot at moving within the company. You have a better shot at having somebody put in a word for you and building your visibility and network beyond your boss.
And that led to, there was a couple of questions about how do you get to the decision maker, if it's not your boss. How do you,
first of all, you've got to ask who it is, and you've got to know. And often people say, well, that's my boss's boss. I can't go to my boss's boss. Well, no, you may not go directly to your boss's boss on the particular negotiation, but how can you get in front of your boss's boss and show your value? Is there some kind of report that you could highlight something specific? I mean, be creative and send it to your boss's boss and say, hey, I noticed you were quoted in the Wall Street Journal last week. I went to a conference and heard X, Y, and Z. Is there any way you can begin to give yourself visibility? Because it is hard to pick up the phone and say, oh, let me come in and talk to you. You also want to understand from your boss what he or she needs to sell it through to the management. So ask your boss, what do you need to pass it by so-and-so? What's going to help you? What can I do?
That's really great. That's very helpful. And there's a lot of other questions sort of around that and the tough issues with difficult bosses and around different situations, getting to. So one of the great questions that's coming up is about the difference in for-profit and nonprofit, and how do you negotiate with an organization that maybe doesn't have a lot of resources?
There's all kinds of different ways to negotiate. It doesn't always have to be around money. It can be around more vacation time. It could be around working from home. And to be creative in, again, what you're willing to accept, what you're not willing to accept, and try to move beyond just salary. There are a lot of valuable things. I can tell you an example. Recently, somebody who was starting a new job on September 3rd, or whatever the day was after Labor Day. And therefore, their health insurance wasn't going to start until November 1st because you had to be at the company a full month before it would start. Well, this individual was not going to be at the company the full month of September. And, that's a hefty amount of money to keep a health plan going for a month on your own. And this individual negotiated to have a start date of September 1st, even though she actually wasn't going to walk into the office until September 3rd or 4th. That was a really clever thing to add into her package. So thinking on salary is what I'm saying. And nonprofits often have more money than you think.
They also need quality people.
They do, and a lot of nonprofits are hiring more people from the corporate sector. It's very interesting.
So another question is, when do you negotiate for salaries? And I think you and I talked about that a little bit too. Is there you want to seize on something?
Well, as I mentioned before, if you've just coming off of the wake of something successful in your company, that is, of course, a great time to negotiate. When you are, being hired for a new job, the later you can negotiate, the better. And it's also great to pose the question to them of what's your range, what's worked, how do you compare to the competition. I really encourage you again to remember that your listener, whoever your listener is on whatever you're negotiating, has an enormous amount of information for you. And often we don't ask the questions. Even if you're trying to sell an idea through at your company to a head of a department or something, that person has an enormous amount of information about what the hurdles are, about what's going to work to get the idea passed. Use them as resources.
So there was a really great question, and I'm trying to find it here. What about negotiating in a team with people who are at the same level with you?
Meaning, how do you get more than team members?
Well, so I think negotiating, and you're all on the same level, but maybe it discusses, maybe benefits are shared. Maybe I need some more information from the person. But so, what are your negotiation in a team with people who are on the same level as you? I think it's also an issue of showing that your worth is.
Yes, that's what I was going to say, is you want to constantly, there are a couple of things you can do to increase your value within an organization, which is really creating a perception about you. And the way you make yourself valuable is, one, you know things that other people don't know. It is expected in a job that you know certain things. How do you go beyond that? How do you know what's going on in other departments? How do you know what's going on, the trends outside of your department? That is one significant way you can create value. The other is networking and connecting with other people in the company where you might have an opportunity to add value. Somebody needs information and they know, oh, I know somebody in that department. Let me call them. And they call you. You need to create your value. You need to establish ways beyond just a job description.
Sarah, I'm getting a couple of clarification questions around that, and how, because one of the things you've talked about is that, okay, negotiations is not just for salary, but how would you use some of these skills if when you're having to work with colleagues or maybe even subordinates to, win them over, get your point across? Do you have any examples of that?
Win your point across. I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, because the key is to know who your listener is and to establish your value to them, what matters to them.
Right. So if there's, if you're negotiating with a team about maybe a process or a project that you want everyone to get on board, and it, that's using this process.
All right. Well, I actually have a client at a technology company, and she's doing exactly that. She wants to put a new process in place, and she has to sell everyone from engineers to marketing people. And she has to get very clear on what matters to each one of these groups. The engineers want a process that allows them a lot of flexibility. They can go in, they can change, they have enough time to, make changes and test, and the marketing people want it to be efficient. So she had to think about, what does this new process deliver to each of these departments? And of course, to the marketing department, it did create efficiency. And to the engineering department, she was a little stuck. So she had to build in an extra step in the process where the engineers would have a certain amount of time to test and retest, or I'm not an engineer. And it was an extra step added to the process, but it was of such great value to the engineers that she was able to convince marketing that one extra step satisfied everybody's needs. Something like that.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good one. So 2 other things. Someone says, never accept the first offer. Is that really true in negotiations, or is that just an old salary?
I would say to every single person, why not ask? What is the harm? So I would say no, don't ever accept the first offer. The worst case scenario is they're going to come back and they will say, we can't do anymore. But what is the harm in asking? If you don't ask, you don't even have a shot at yes.
Absolutely. And one more question I think we have time for is there any difference or any special technique for consultants who are negotiating their fees or hourly rates or anything like that?
It really comes down to the same thing as being inside a company, is how do you show your value? And showing your value is being more knowledgeable than the next guy. It's being able to articulate your expertise. I mean, this is a whole nother workshop, but so often people can't really articulate what distinguishes them from the next consultant or distinguishes them from the next candidate in a unique way.
Mm-hmm. We are so happy to have Sarah with us here today. I really appreciate all her time and her energy. If you want to contact her, here's her information. If you want to follow us on Facebook or Twitter or check out our web pages, please do that. My colleague and I, Donna Curry, are here to try and help you, and we always want feedbacks, and we always want to improve our services, so let us know. I am continuing this webinar series. The next 2 upcoming webinars are Mike Baker and Aletta Margolis. Mike Baker runs a company called Data Zoo. He started that company from scratch. Now it is a very well-known marketing data company. He has several hundred employees. They hire lots of interns through us, and he's going to talk a little bit about that process and, the next stages of actually running a startup after it's not a startup anymore. And then we're going to have Aletta Margolis, who founded a different kind of business. She's a social entrepreneur, and she's had the Center for Inspired Teaching for several years, and she's going to talk a little bit about that organization and the field of education and and it all revolves around being passionate in your career. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you again, Sarah, for being here with us. And thank you to all of our participants for joining us today.
Thank you.